Some relatives stay poor for a reason, my niece Olivia said as she lifted her champagne glass, her voice light and playful, but just loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. A few people laughed politely. Someone clinked their glass against hers. And then, almost like it was part of the entertainment, several pairs of eyes turned toward me. I smiled the same quiet smile I had worn for years, the kind that made people assume I hadn't noticed anything at all. The ballroom of the Lakeside Country Club glittered under rows of warm golden lights, and the windows behind Olivia framed the dark blue stretch of Lake Erie like a painting. It was her 28th birthday, and the celebration had all the elegance money could buy. White orchids on every table, waiters carrying trays of sparkling drinks, and a string quartet playing soft music near the dance floor. Olivia stood in the center of it all, tall and confident in a silver dress that shimmered each time she moved. She looked very much like her father used to look when he walked into a room, certain the world belonged to him. To success, she continued, raising her glass higher, and to never settling for less. More laughter followed, warm and approving, the kind of laughter people give when they admire someone with money. I lifted my own glass of sparkling water and nodded slightly, as if her words had nothing to do with me at all. In truth, I had heard variations of that joke for years. In Olivia's version of the family story, I was the quiet aunt from the modest side of the family, the one who lived in a small house in Ohio, drove a 10-year-old sedan, and never seemed particularly interested in the kind of glamorous life she enjoyed. People assumed things when they saw me. They assumed I struggled. They assumed I didn't understand money. They assumed I had simply never made it. Olivia had been especially fond of that narrative. Earlier that evening, she had been introducing guests around the room. "This is my friend Tyler," she said to a tall man in a navy suit. "He works in venture capital." Then she gestured toward another woman. "And this is Jenna. She just launched a startup in San Francisco." When her hand eventually drifted in my direction, her smile shifted slightly. "And this," she added, with an easy laugh, "is my Aunt Margaret. She prefers the quiet life." It was a polite way of saying something else entirely, and the people around us understood it. They nodded kindly, the way people do when they believe they're being generous to someone less fortunate. I returned their nods and said nothing. Silence can be a very useful thing when people underestimate you. As the music played and conversations filled the room again, Olivia stepped down from the small stage where she had given her toast. Guests gathered around her immediately, offering hugs and gifts wrapped in glossy paper. She accepted the attention easily, like someone who had grown up believing celebration was her natural environment. I watched from my seat near the window, the lake reflecting faint silver light beyond the glass. For a moment, I saw another version of this scene, one from many years earlier. Olivia at 6 years old, sitting at the kitchen table in my brother Robert's house, swinging her legs under the chair while she colored pictures with bright crayons. Back then she had been a cheerful little girl with messy hair and a laugh that filled the whole room. Robert used to watch her with quiet pride, as if every drawing she made was a masterpiece. Robert had always believed in planning ahead. Even when Olivia was small, he talked about her future constantly, about education, opportunity, and making sure she would never have to worry about money the way our family once had. That was simply the kind of man my brother was. Careful, responsible, protective. I took a slow sip of my drink and returned my attention to the present. Across the room, Olivia was now speaking with a group of friends near the bar. One of them, a young man with slick hair and a designer watch, asked a question that drifted clearly across the room. "So who manages your trust fund?" he said casually, like someone discussing the weather. Olivia laughed, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "Oh, I don't know," she replied. "Probably some boring lawyer." I lowered my glass slightly and watched the reflection of the lights on the lake. After a moment, I allowed myself the smallest smile. Because Olivia Carter, my confident, successful, certain niece, had absolutely no idea who was actually in charge of every dollar waiting for her future. The laughter near the bar faded into the soft hum of conversation as the quartet began another slow piece, and I remained by the window long enough to watch the reflection of the ballroom lights ripple across the dark surface of the lake before finally standing and walking toward the rest of the guests, moving slowly enough that no one would feel interrupted, yet close enough to hear the conversation that had started a few minutes earlier. Olivia was leaning against the marble counter of the bar, holding a glass of sparkling rose while her friends surrounded her in a loose circle, their voices bright with the easy confidence that comes from never having had to question where the next opportunity will come from. The young man who had asked about the trust fund was still there, turning his watch slightly, as if admiring the polished metal under the light. Seriously, though, he said with a grin, those things are complicated. Somebody has to manage the investments. Who actually handles yours? Olivia shrugged as if the question was barely worth thinking about. I told you, she replied, smiling in that relaxed way that made people assume she always had the answers. It is probably some lawyer my father hired years ago. One of those quiet types who just signs papers and sends statements. Her friend Jenna laughed softly. You should know who controls your money, she said. My family accountant sends me updates every quarter. Olivia waved a dismissive hand. The investments are fine. My father made sure of that before he passed away. It is not like I need to check every little detail. The group nodded in agreement, and the conversation drifted toward travel plans and real estate markets, but I had already heard what I needed. I took another sip of sparkling water and allowed the music to fill the space between their voices while memories began to move quietly through my mind. My brother Robert had never believed in leaving things to chance. When Olivia was still a teenager, he began arranging her financial future with the same patience he used for everything else in life. He met with attorneys. He studied investment reports late into the evening. I remember sitting across from him at his kitchen table one autumn afternoon when he first mentioned the trust fund. The leaves outside his window had turned bright shades of red and gold, and he kept adjusting his glasses while he explained the structure of the account with careful precision. Olivia will have every opportunity, he said, sliding a folder across the table toward me. Education, travel, security, everything she could need. I remember asking him why he looked so serious if the plan was already complete. Robert leaned back in his chair and stared at the folder for a long moment before answering. Because money is not only opportunity, he said quietly. Sometimes it is temptation. He closed the folder gently and rested his hand on top of it, as if the weight of the papers mattered more than the numbers printed inside. She is young, Margaret, and the world she is growing up in moves fast. I want someone steady to protect her future until she understands what responsibility really means. I understood exactly what he was asking before he even said it out loud. The memory faded as the sound of glasses clinking returned me to the present moment inside the ballroom. Olivia was laughing again, her voice rising above the music as she told a story about a recent weekend in Miami. Around her, people listened with admiration, the way they always do when someone speaks confidently about success. I watched her for a moment longer and felt the same mixture of affection and concern that had followed me for years. She had grown into a remarkable young woman in many ways, intelligent and ambitious, but confidence can sometimes disguise something else entirely. Across the room, the event coordinator walked past carrying a tray of wrapped gifts toward a long table near the stage, and the reflections from the crystal chandeliers shimmered across the polished floor. I turned my attention back to the lake beyond the windows, calm and dark under the night sky. Olivia believed the future waiting for her was already within reach, something guaranteed and permanent. What she did not realize was that every investment decision, every release of funds, and every safeguard protecting that fortune had always required one quiet signature. And that signature belonged to the aunt she believed had spent her life on the poor side of the family. The soft melody of the string quartet continued as I stepped away from the lakefront windows and made my way toward the quieter corner of the ballroom where the family had gathered for photographs. The golden chandeliers cast long reflections across the polished floor, and the faint scent of white lilies from the centerpieces lingered in the air. I paused briefly to watch Olivia, her laughter flowing freely as she posed with her friends, adjusting her silver dress and tilting her head as if every angle mattered, not realizing how the world outside this room moved at a pace she had yet to fully grasp. I remembered how meticulously my brother Robert had instructed me regarding the trust fund, emphasizing that it was more than money. It was the safeguard for Olivia's future, meant to give her opportunities while keeping her grounded until she could appreciate the responsibility that came with it. The thought of her standing there, unaware that each decision about her funds had been under my supervision, made me feel a quiet resolve settle deep in my chest. I moved toward the refreshments table, passing trays of canapes that had gone mostly untouched, and allowed my eyes to scan the room once more. The guests were engaged in light conversation, commenting on the city skyline beyond the windows, discussing upcoming trips, and exchanging polite remarks about careers and investments. Olivia's voice rang out occasionally above the murmurs, sharing stories about her recent weekend in Boston and the gala she attended, yet there was no sense of caution in her words, no hint that she knew how delicately her financial future had been arranged. I sipped my sparkling water slowly, letting the subtle carbonation fill my senses, and thought about the countless evenings spent reviewing statements, adjusting portfolios, and communicating with attorneys to ensure that the allocations would remain protected. The trust was not something anyone could simply inherit without understanding the framework behind it, and Robert had made that explicitly clear in his notes. My presence in the room was quiet but deliberate, a silent observation that allowed me to gauge not only Olivia's confidence, but also the subtle undercurrents among the other family members who had grown accustomed to assuming I was less significant because of my simpler lifestyle. Nobody suspected that I had the keys to an intricate plan laid out decades before, and in that moment, it was a comforting thought that the responsibility, though immense, was entirely mine to uphold. I moved back toward the table where Olivia's closest friends had gathered, pretending to inspect the flower arrangements, and noticed how easily they deferred to her judgments, how naturally she commanded attention without even realizing it. Meanwhile, I recalled the late afternoons spent in my brother's study, reviewing the trust fund documents with a steady hand, learning the nuances of investment reports and legal stipulations, quietly understanding that this knowledge would one day position me as the guardian of her fortune. The evening carried on with laughter, toasts, and the occasional clinking of glasses, yet I remained observant, listening, noting, and mentally cataloging every detail of her behavior. Every casual remark about expenditures, every confident declaration about her independence, knowing that the real measure of her readiness had yet to come. As the soft light flickered against the crystal centerpieces and the quartet shifted to a more upbeat tune, I felt a sense of calm authority wrap around me. This room, filled with celebration and carefree chatter, was also a space where I silently held the weight of responsibility. The invisible oversight that ensured Olivia's future remained secure, and where patience, observation, and quiet determination were more powerful than any boastful claim or careless assumption. I allowed the music and the gentle hum of conversation to carry me through the evening, my presence unremarked yet purposeful, fully aware that every decision I had made up to this point had led to this very night, where appearances of simplicity and humility cloaked the careful stewardship of a trust fund designed to protect and guide a young woman still discovering the boundaries of independence and understanding. As the evening wore on, the laughter and chatter in the ballroom created a warm, vibrant atmosphere, yet I remained quietly observant, moving with deliberate calm from one corner of the room to another, taking note of each interaction without drawing attention to myself. The chandeliers above reflected off polished silverware and glassware, casting delicate light patterns across the tables, and I allowed my eyes to drift over the guests, each absorbed in their own conversations, unaware of the subtle undercurrents I was tracking. Olivia moved among her friends, gesturing animatedly, her voice carrying with confidence and charm, yet behind her expressions, I could sense the untested assumptions she held about her independence and the financial resources she believed were hers to manage. I recalled the afternoons spent with my brother Robert reviewing documents that outlined the trust fund, the careful instructions he had left for me as trustee, and the foresight he had demonstrated in planning for Olivia's future with such meticulous precision. Every statement, every investment choice, and every contingency had been designed to protect her from the pitfalls that could come with sudden access to significant wealth. And I had taken those responsibilities seriously, fully aware that my actions, or inactions, could shape her understanding of stewardship and responsibility. I found a quiet spot near the refreshment table and watched as Olivia laughed at a story shared by one of her college friends, the casual display of ease and entitlement reinforcing the very reason my vigilance remained necessary. As I sipped from my glass of sparkling water, I reflected on the patience required to manage the trust fund and the strategy involved in allowing Olivia to grow into her inheritance with measured understanding, knowing that the value of guidance often surpasses the value of immediate access. Each moment of observation provided insight into her temperament, her decision-making tendencies, and the confidence she displayed, which, while admirable, had not yet been tempered by the experience required to manage substantial financial responsibility. The music shifted to a slower movement, and couples began to sway gently across the dance floor. The soft murmur of conversation and the clinking of glasses created a backdrop that felt both intimate and celebratory, yet my awareness of the deeper currents remained undisturbed. I remembered Robert's quiet voice, explaining that the trust was as much a tool for education as it was a safeguard, emphasizing that having resources without understanding accountability could be as dangerous as having none at all. I moved closer to the group of guests seated near the windows, listening to their discussion about travel plans and market trends, noting how readily Olivia's peers deferred to her opinions, how easily she commanded attention without ever having to assert dominance, and how her confidence, while natural, had yet to be tested against the responsibilities she would eventually face. The evening continued with smiles and polite laughter, yet underneath the surface, I maintained a steady presence, a subtle authority that had been quietly cultivated over years of managing the trust, reviewing statements, and coordinating with attorneys, ensuring that every decision aligned with the principles my brother had established. The reflections on the lake outside the windows shimmered under the soft glow of the city lights, and I allowed myself a small moment of satisfaction knowing that the future I was entrusted with remained secure, guided by careful oversight and a quiet vigilance that those around me could neither see nor fully comprehend. As the evening carried on, full of celebration, yet measured and balanced by the invisible responsibility I quietly held. As the evening moved deeper into the night, the guests continued to mingle, their voices blending into a soft background hum that underscored the glittering ambience of the ballroom. And I found a quiet corner near the tall windows overlooking the lake, where the reflections of city lights danced across the water in long, gentle streaks. Olivia was still at the center of attention, laughing easily and recounting stories of recent trips and social events, her friends nodding along and asking questions that drew even more elaborate answers. I observed her carefully, noting the confidence in her gestures, the way she held her glass of sparkling rose, the subtle mannerisms that spoke of privilege and expectation, and I reminded myself that each of these moments, though seemingly carefree, was part of the environment she had grown accustomed to, one where money and influence often masked the need for experience and responsibility. I took a slow sip of water and allowed the sounds and movements of the room to wash over me, paying attention to small details. The way Olivia's friend adjusted a bracelet, the tilt of her head as she emphasized a point, the quick, almost imperceptible glance at a smartphone to confirm a schedule. In these details, I could see patterns forming, habits and tendencies that would guide how she managed resources once given full access, and I understood why my brother had entrusted me with oversight, knowing that guidance would be more valuable than immediate control. My thoughts drifted back to the many hours spent reviewing documents, confirming investment strategies, and ensuring that the trust fund would remain secure, a silent guardian of the future my brother had envisioned for his daughter. I remembered his voice, calm and precise, explaining that trust was not only about the money itself, but about the lessons, patience, and foresight required to use it wisely, and how he had relied on my judgment to provide stability while allowing Olivia to mature and understand the responsibilities that came with privilege. The hum of the quartet shifted to a softer, more contemplative melody, and I allowed my attention to wander to the guests seated at nearby tables, watching as they engaged in conversation, their laughter and polite responses creating a backdrop that highlighted Olivia's natural confidence. I thought about the way she had been raised, the assumptions she carried about her own knowledge, and the independence she felt entitled to, and I reflected on the quiet satisfaction of knowing that the structure in place would ensure she learned responsibility at a measured pace. The room was full of warmth and movement, yet my presence remained a steady, almost invisible force, observing, assessing, and guiding without interference, fully aware that every subtle action I took in managing the trust would shape her understanding and future decisions. As I stood and moved slightly closer to the center of the room, allowing my gaze to sweep over the smiling faces and polished decor, I felt a quiet assurance that the trust fund, the security, and the opportunities it represented were safe in my hands, balanced with care, and that Olivia's awareness of my role, when the time came, would be a revelation both surprising and instructive, a lesson in patience, responsibility, and the thoughtful stewardship of the resources her father had so carefully prepared. As the evening began to wind down, the music softened, the chatter of guests blending into a gentle hum that filled the elegant room with a comfortable, ambient energy. I lingered near a corner table decorated with a vase of white orchids, observing Olivia as she moved through the crowd, her laughter light, unguarded, completely unaware of the careful oversight that had shaped the circumstances around her. She was animated, recounting anecdotes about her recent travels and professional achievements, and the guests nodded along, captivated by her charm and confidence. I took a slow sip from my glass of sparkling water, letting the subtle bubbles rise as I reflected on the months and years that had led to this moment. The preparation, the detailed review of statements, the careful planning that ensured every aspect of the trust fund would remain protected until Olivia was truly ready to comprehend the responsibility it carried. The room glowed under the golden chandeliers, their light reflecting off polished glassware and silver flatware, casting delicate patterns on the hardwood floor. I noticed the smallest gestures, a tilt of a head, the way Olivia shifted her weight as she spoke, the subtle way her eyes tracked the reactions of those around her, all clues to her temperament, her natural confidence, and her readiness to face greater responsibility. My thoughts wandered to conversations with my brother Robert before his passing, his quiet voice explaining the importance of patience, guidance, and the stewardship of resources, and how he had relied on me to maintain that stability. Every decision I had made, every check and balance I had put in place, had been with the intent of allowing Olivia to mature without facing the unintended consequences of premature access to her inheritance. The gentle hum of conversation was occasionally punctuated by the clinking of glasses, laughter, or the soft shuffle of feet across the polished floor, yet I remained a silent observer, measuring, noting, and anticipating the moments when guidance would be most necessary. The soft reflection of city lights shimmered across the lake outside the windows, a constant reminder of the world beyond the walls of the ballroom, where patience and careful planning held their own quiet power. I watched Olivia continue her conversation with a group of friends, noting how naturally she commanded attention, how easily she assumed control of the narrative, and yet, beneath her confidence, there was an innocence born of not yet knowing the full extent of the responsibility and oversight that had protected her all these years. I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible smile as I considered the subtle influence I held, a presence unnoticed by others but always vigilant, ensuring that the foundation laid by Robert would not be undermined, and that Olivia's eventual realization of the trust structure would be both a revelation and a lesson in understanding, stewardship, and the careful balance between opportunity and responsibility. By the time the candles on the tables had burned down halfway, the music had shifted again, slower, more reflective, and I found myself moving toward the balcony overlooking the lake, where the gentle ripple of water mirrored the subtle movement of the chandeliers inside. Olivia had paused for a moment, accepting a toast from a friend, her smile bright and unguarded, unaware of the watchful eye that followed her every action, noting both her confidence and the assumptions that accompanied it. I leaned against the railing, the cool night air brushing against my skin, and allowed my thoughts to drift over the events of the evening, remembering the conversations with Robert about trust and responsibility, and the careful planning he had entrusted to me to guide Olivia without her knowledge. The trust fund was more than numbers and statements. It was a framework designed to teach, to protect, and to cultivate understanding before freedom, and every decision I had made up to this moment had been carefully calibrated to preserve that balance. I observed the guests as they continued to enjoy the evening, the gentle murmur of conversations blending with the soft music, and I could see the admiration in their eyes as Olivia recounted stories of her successes, her travels, and the professional milestones she had achieved, never questioning the oversight that had kept her opportunities secure. Each gesture, each word, each glance was a piece of a larger puzzle that I had come to understand over the years, and I knew that the revelation of the trust management would one day shift her perspective entirely. I moved back inside, letting the warmth of the room envelop me again, and watched as Olivia gathered a small group of friends around a table, laughing and discussing plans for the upcoming months, oblivious to the fact that every detail of her financial future had been carefully guided and safeguarded. The subtle power of that knowledge settled within me, quiet yet unyielding, a steady presence that ensured the foundations laid by Robert would continue to shape her understanding. I noticed how naturally she assumed leadership in her group, how easily she managed the attention of those around her. Yet I also noted the inexperience behind her confidence, the small gaps that would, in time, provide lessons once the truth of her situation became known. I stood in the background, moving with ease through the room, blending in yet fully aware of the significance of each interaction, each choice she made that evening, understanding that patience and observation were as important as any document or statement. The night carried on with laughter and quiet conversations, reflections of light across glass and water, and I felt the weight and satisfaction of responsibility, knowing that when the time came to reveal the full truth of the trust, Olivia would experience both the surprise and the lesson embedded within, a revelation that would deepen her understanding of stewardship, patience, and the quiet influence that had guided her future until now.